I never expected to inherit anything from Grandpa Joe. We weren't particularly close, and I'd only visited his farm a handful of times as a child. So when the lawyer called to inform me that Joseph Miller had left me his entire property, I was stunned. The drive to Miller's farm took 3 hours through winding country roads. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, memories flooded back. The smell of hay, the sound of chickens clucking, and Grandpa Joe's weathered hands showing me how to milk cows. The farmhouse looked exactly as I remembered. White clapboard siding with green shutters, a wraparound porch, and that old oak tree where he'd hung a tire swing. But something felt different now. Empty. Final. Inside, dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through lace curtains. Everything was preserved like a museum, his coffee cup still on the kitchen table, reading glasses folded beside yesterday's newspaper. The lawyer had given me a thick envelope containing the deed, insurance papers, and a handwritten note. "Sarah, this land has been in our family for generations. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. Check the old oak tree when you're ready to understand. Love, Grandpa Joe." I studied the deed carefully. According to the legal documents, I owned 43 acres of farmland, the house, and 2 barns. But I distinctly remembered Grandpa Joe telling me stories about the 100 acres and how our family had worked this land since the 1800s. Something didn't add up. Where were the other 57 acres? Had my memory failed me? Or was there more to this inheritance than met the eye? The note mentioned the oak tree. Tomorrow I would investigate. Morning came with the sound of roosters crowing from the neighboring farm. I'd spent the night in Grandpa Joe's bed, surrounded by the familiar scent of Old Spice and pipe tobacco that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. After a simple breakfast of coffee and toast, I walked outside to examine the oak tree. It stood majestically in the front yard, its massive trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. The tire swing hung motionless, weathered by decades of seasons. I circled the tree slowly, running my hands over the rough bark, looking for anything unusual. On the side facing away from the house, I discovered something carved into the trunk. 1983, 3 feet north, 2 feet down. My heart raced. Grandpa Joe had left me a treasure map of sorts. I hurried to the barn and found an old shovel among his tools. The metal was rusty but functional. Back at the oak tree, I measured 3 feet north from the carved message and began digging. The soil was hard-packed, and my city-soft hands quickly developed blisters. But I persisted, driven by curiosity and the growing suspicion that this discovery would answer my questions about the missing acreage. 2 feet down, the shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang. My pulse quickened as I carefully cleared away the dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal box. It took another 20 minutes of careful excavation to fully uncover a medium-sized steel lockbox, green with age and moisture, but still intact. A small padlock secured the latch, but decades of rust had weakened it considerably. I carried the box to the porch and found a hammer in Grandpa Joe's toolbox. With one solid strike, the lock broke away. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid of the metal box. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags, were documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my inheritance. The first item was a deed. Not the one the lawyer had given me, but an older document dated 1923. This deed clearly stated that the Miller family owned 112 acres, not the 43 listed in my current paperwork. Beneath the deed lay a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The return address read, Hartwell and Associates, Legal Services. I untied the ribbon with shaking fingers and began reading the top letter, dated March 15th, 1983. Dear Mr. Miller, it began, as discussed, we have completed the fraudulent transfer of 69 acres from your property to Blackstone Development Corporation. The falsified documents have been filed with the county recorder's office, and the original deed has been destroyed as requested. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Someone had stolen nearly 70 acres from my grandfather's farm through fraudulent paperwork. But why would a law firm admit to fraud in writing? The next letter provided the answer. It was from Grandpa Joe to the law firm, dated the same day. Gentlemen, I have copies of all our correspondence and documentation of your illegal activities. If anything happens to me or my family, these documents will be delivered to the State Attorney General's office. My grandfather had been blackmailing his own lawyers. But why? What had forced him into such a desperate situation? I continued reading, piecing together a story of corruption, threats, and a grandfather's determination to protect his family's legacy, even if it meant appearing to lose everything in the process. The truth was more complex than I could have imagined. The deeper I dug into the letters, the clearer the picture became. In 1982, Blackstone Development Corporation had approached Grandpa Joe about selling his land for a shopping mall development. When he refused, they'd apparently decided to take it anyway. According to the correspondence, Blackstone had bribed officials at Hartwell and Associates to create fraudulent documents transferring ownership of 69 acres. They'd planned to claim the land through adverse possession and legal technicalities, betting that an elderly farmer wouldn't have the resources to fight them in court. But they'd underestimated Joseph Miller. Instead of fighting the theft directly, he'd gathered evidence of the conspiracy and turned the tables. The lawyers, terrified of exposure and disbarment, had agreed to pay him monthly consulting fees in exchange for his silence. For over 30 years, Grandpa Joe had collected payments while appearing to be a victim of the land grab. The money had allowed him to maintain the farm and even expand his operations on the remaining acreage. A bank statement in the box showed the final payment, deposited just 2 weeks before his death. The account contained over $200,000, money that was now mine as his sole heir. But the most important document was a letter addressed to me personally, dated just 6 months ago. Grandpa Joe's handwriting was shaky but determined. Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've found my insurance policy. The lawyers are all dead now, and Blackstone went bankrupt in 2008. It's time to reclaim what's ours. He'd included detailed instructions for proving the fraud and reclaiming the stolen land. The original deed, witness statements and recorded phone conversations were all preserved in the box. My grandfather hadn't lost the land. He'd been playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The next morning, I called the law office that had handled Grandpa Joe's estate. When I explained what I'd discovered, the lawyer, Mr. Peterson, asked me to come in immediately. His office was a study in mahogany and leather, with law books lining every wall. Peterson, a man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, examined the documents with growing amazement. "Mrs. Sarah, this is extraordinary," he said, adjusting his glasses. "If these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, your grandfather was the victim of a massive fraud. However, proving it after 40 years won't be simple." He explained the legal challenges ahead. The fraudulent deed had been on file for decades, and the current owners of the disputed land had purchased it in good faith. Even if we could prove the original theft, unwinding 40 years of subsequent transactions would be complex. "But there's hope," Peterson continued. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraud when the victim was actively prevented from discovering it. Your grandfather's evidence suggests he knew about the fraud but was coerced into silence through threats." We spent the next 3 hours going through every document in the box. Peterson was particularly interested in the recorded phone conversations, which were stored on old cassette tapes wrapped in plastic. "These recordings could be the key," he said. "If they contain admissions of fraud or threats against your grandfather, we have a strong case. But first, we need to have them professionally authenticated and digitized." I left his office with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Reclaiming the land would mean a lengthy legal battle against whoever currently owned it. But I owed it to Grandpa Joe's memory to see this through. The fight for my family's legacy was just beginning. Peterson's research revealed that the stolen 69 acres were now owned by Riverside Estates, a residential development company. They'd purchased the land from Blackstone's bankruptcy estate in 2009 and had built 37 houses on what should have been Miller family property. The irony wasn't lost on me. Families were now living on land that had been stolen from my family. These weren't corporate villains, but ordinary people who'd bought homes in good faith. The thought of displacing them made my stomach churn. I drove out to see the development, following the property lines marked on the old survey maps from Grandpa Joe's box. What I found was a typical suburban neighborhood: neat lawns, children's bicycles in driveways, and minivans parked in garages. Standing at the edge of what should have been Miller land, I watched kids playing in a park that had been built where my great-grandfather's wheat fields once grew. How could I possibly claim this land now? What would happen to these families? But then I remembered something from the documents. Grandpa Joe had been paying property taxes on the full 100 acres for 40 years, even though he only officially owned 43. The county had been double collecting taxes, once from him and once from the subsequent owners. That evening, I called Peterson with my discovery. His excitement was palpable through the phone. "Sarah, this changes everything," he said. "If your grandfather continued paying taxes on the disputed land, it strengthens our claim considerably. More importantly, it means the county has been collecting illegal taxes for decades. They'll want to settle this quickly and quietly." He explained that we could potentially reach an agreement where the county would compensate the current homeowners for relocating using the illegal tax money they'd collected. It wouldn't be simple, but it offered a path forward that didn't destroy innocent families. For the first time since opening the box, I felt hopeful about finding a just solution. The next week brought an unexpected phone call. The caller identified herself as Margaret Chen, a reporter for the county newspaper who'd been investigating historical land fraud cases. "Ms. Miller, I understand you've discovered some irregularities with your grandfather's property," she said. "I'd like to discuss this with you because I believe your case is connected to a larger pattern of corruption I've been researching." We met at a small cafe in town, where Margaret spread out a folder thick with documents and newspaper clippings. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded me of Grandpa Joe. "Your grandfather's case isn't isolated," she explained. "Between 1980 and 1985, at least 12 families in this county lost land through similar fraudulent schemes. Hartwell and Associates was involved in most of them, working with various development companies." She showed me newspaper articles about other families who'd fought similar battles, most unsuccessfully. The pattern was always the same: elderly landowners, fraudulent paperwork, and legal intimidation. "But your grandfather was smart," Margaret continued. "He's the only one who gathered evidence and fought back. Most of the other families just gave up and moved away." Margaret's investigation had already uncovered connections between Hartwell and Associates and county officials who'd approved the fraudulent transfers. Several of those officials had received mysterious consulting payments from development companies during the same period. "If we can prove your case, it opens the door to investigating all the others," she said. "Some of those families are still alive. They deserve justice too." I realized that Grandpa Joe's fight wasn't just about our family's land. It was about exposing a systematic corruption that had affected dozens of families. The weight of that responsibility was both daunting and motivating. Margaret offered to help publicize the case, which could pressure officials to act more quickly on our legal claims. Peterson had arranged for the cassette tapes to be professionally digitized and authenticated at a forensics lab in the state capital. When the results came back, they exceeded our wildest expectations. The tapes contained over 6 hours of recorded phone conversations between Grandpa Joe and various conspirators. The audio quality was surprisingly good, and the content was damning. In one conversation from April 1983, I heard a voice identified as Robert Hartwell, the senior partner of the law firm. "Joe, you need to understand that fighting this will only make things worse for you and your family. We have connections throughout the county government. Accept the settlement and walk away." Grandpa Joe's voice was steady but tense. "You stole my land, Robert. 69 acres that's been in my family for generations. I want it back." "That's not going to happen," Hartwell replied. "But we're prepared to offer you $50,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and accept the new property boundaries. And if I refuse, then you might find yourself facing tax audits, building code violations, and other administrative difficulties. Farming is hard enough without the government making it harder." The threat was clear, and it explained why Grandpa Joe had chosen blackmail over direct confrontation. He'd been protecting not just his land, but his entire livelihood. Other recordings revealed the scope of the conspiracy. County assessors, building inspectors, and even the sheriff's department had been involved in pressuring landowners to accept fraudulent land transfers. Peterson was ecstatic. "Sarah, these recordings are smoking guns. They prove fraud, conspiracy, and official corruption. No court in the country would ignore this evidence." But I was thinking about something else. Grandpa Joe's courage in facing down these powerful men while protecting his family. He'd been fighting a war I never knew existed. Margaret's first article appeared on the front page of the county newspaper with the headline, "Local Farmers' Hidden Evidence Exposes Decades-Old Land Fraud." The story detailed our discoveries and included excerpts from the recorded conversations. The reaction was immediate and explosive. By noon, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from other newspapers, television stations, and families who claimed they'd been victims of similar schemes. The county commissioner's office issued a terse statement promising a thorough investigation, while the current owners of Riverside Estates hired their own legal team to protect their interests. But the most significant call came from an unexpected source. A woman named Dorothy Hartwell, Robert Hartwell's widow, asked to meet with me privately. We met at the same cafe where I'd first talked with Margaret. Dorothy was an elegant woman in her 70s, impeccably dressed but with worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "Ms. Miller, I need you to know that I had no idea what my husband was doing," she began. "After he died in 1995, I found some disturbing documents in his home office. I've been carrying this guilt for 28 years. She handed me a manila envelope containing additional evidence, internal memos from Hartwell and Associates discussing the fraudulent land transfers, payment records showing bribes to county officials, and a list of all the properties involved in the scheme. There were 17 families," she said quietly. "Your grandfather was just one of many. Robert and his partners stole over 800 acres total." Dorothy explained that her husband had become increasingly paranoid in his final years, convinced that someone would eventually expose the conspiracy. He'd kept detailed records as insurance against his co-conspirators. "I wanted to come forward years ago, but I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of losing everything, afraid of going to prison for crimes I didn't commit. But seeing your courage has inspired me to finally do the right thing." Her evidence would make our case ironclad and potentially help other families reclaim their stolen land. Within a week of Dorothy's revelations, the county attorney's office requested an emergency meeting. Peterson and I arrived at the courthouse to find a room full of lawyers representing various parties: the county, Riverside Estates, and several insurance companies. The county attorney, a nervous man named Williams, got straight to the point. Ms. Miller, we're prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement that we believe addresses all parties' interests. The proposal was complex, but generous. The county would purchase the 37 houses in Riverside Estates at above market prices, allowing the current owners to relocate without financial loss. The land would then be returned to the Miller family estate. Additionally, the county would pay damages of $500,000 for the illegal tax collections and establish a fund to investigate and compensate other victims of the land fraud scheme. We're also prepared to pursue criminal charges against any living participants in the conspiracy, Williams added, though most of the primary actors are deceased. Peterson reviewed the settlement terms carefully. It's a fair offer, Sarah, probably better than we'd get in court even with our strong evidence, but the decision is yours. I thought about Grandpa Joe and what he would have wanted. He'd spent 30 years fighting for justice, not just money. The settlement would restore our family's land and help other victims, but it would also let the county avoid a lengthy public trial that might expose additional corruption. I need time to think about it, I said. And I want to talk to some of the other families who were affected. Williams nodded. Take all the time you need, but please understand that this offer won't remain open indefinitely. The longer this drags out, the more complicated it becomes for everyone involved. As we left the courthouse, I realized that the hardest part of this journey wasn't uncovering the truth. It was deciding what to do with it. Margaret helped me contact several families who'd been victims of the land fraud scheme. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to ours. Elderly farmers pressured into accepting fraudulent land transfers, families forced to abandon generational properties, and decades of legal battles that ended in defeat. I met with 3 families who were still alive and living in the area. The Johnsons had lost 40 acres that became a strip mall. The Kowalskis had been forced to sell their dairy farm when boundary disputes made it impossible to operate profitably. The Washingtons, an African-American family, had lost 60 acres to what they'd been told was eminent domain, though no public project was ever built on their land. Each family had suspected fraud, but lacked the resources or evidence to fight back effectively. They'd watched helplessly as their heritage was stolen and sold to developers. Your grandfather was the only one who outsmarted them, said Tom Johnson, now 83, and living in a small apartment in town. We heard rumors that he'd made some kind of deal, but we never knew the details. The Kowalski family was particularly bitter. We lost everything, said Anna Kowalski, tears in her eyes. 4 generations of dairy farming gone. My children had to move to the city to find work. But when I explained the settlement offer and the possibility of compensation for other victims, their attitudes changed. Even if they couldn't get their land back, acknowledgement of the injustice and financial compensation would mean something. It won't bring back my father's farm, said Robert Washington, but it might help my grandchildren understand that we didn't just give up, we were robbed. Their stories strengthened my resolve to accept the settlement. While a public trial might expose more corruption, these families needed closure and compensation more than they needed vindication. The decision was becoming clearer, but I still had one more person to consult, in a way. That evening I sat on the porch of Grandpa Joe's farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The metal box sat beside me, its contents now familiar but still powerful. I pulled out his final letter to me and read it again by the fading light. His words seemed to speak directly to my current dilemma. Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found my insurance policy. It's time to reclaim what's ours. But what did reclaim really mean? Was it about getting the land back? Or was it about something deeper, restoring honor to our family name and ensuring justice for others who'd been wronged? I thought about the choices Grandpa Joe had made. He could have fought the fraud publicly in 1983, but he'd chosen a different path, one that protected his family while gathering evidence for future justice. He'd sacrificed his reputation, allowing people to think he'd lost the land through poor business decisions, rather than revealing he was being blackmailed. Now I faced a similar choice. I could reject the settlement and demand a public trial that would expose every detail of the corruption. It would be satisfying to see the full truth revealed, but it would also delay justice for other victims and create uncertainty for the innocent families living on our land. Or I could accept the settlement, knowing it represented the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The land returned, other victims compensated, and a peaceful resolution that honored Grandpa Joe's patient strategy. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I made my decision. Grandpa Joe had taught me that sometimes the most powerful victory is the one that lifts others up rather than tearing enemies down. I would accept the settlement, but with one additional condition that I hoped would honor his memory properly. The next morning, I called Peterson with my decision and my additional condition. "I'll accept the settlement," I told him, "but I want the county to establish a permanent memorial to acknowledge what happened and ensure it never happens again." Peterson was intrigued. "What kind of memorial are you thinking about?" "I want them to create a public park on part of the reclaimed land," I explained. "It should include a monument listing all the families who lost land to fraud and educational displays explaining how the corruption worked and how it was stopped. Most importantly, I want it named the Joseph Miller Memorial Park for Truth and Justice." When Peterson presented this condition to the county attorney, there was initial resistance. "A memorial seems unnecessary," Williams argued. "The financial settlement should be sufficient." But Margaret's continued newspaper coverage had made the case a matter of public interest. Citizens were demanding accountability, and the county commissioners were facing pressure to demonstrate their commitment to preventing future corruption. After 2 days of negotiations, the county agreed to all terms. The settlement would proceed as originally outlined, with the addition of a 5-acre memorial park that would serve as both a tribute to the victims and a warning to future would-be conspirators. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the following Friday at the courthouse. Representatives from all the affected families would be present, along with county officials and members of the press. As I prepared for the ceremony, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Grandpa Joe's long game had finally reached its conclusion, and justice would be served not just for our family, but for all the victims of the land fraud scheme. The boy who'd buried evidence under an oak tree in 1983 had grown into a man who understood that true victory sometimes requires patience, strategy, and the courage to fight for others as well as yourself. His granddaughter had learned those lessons well. The signing ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I'd first inherited the farm. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, county officials, and members of the affected families. As I signed the settlement documents, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. What had started as confusion about missing acreage had become a quest for justice that spanned 4 decades and affected dozens of families. County Commissioner Patricia Hayes addressed the crowd. "Today, we acknowledge a grave injustice that occurred in our community and take steps to ensure it never happens again. The establishment of the Joseph Miller Memorial Park for Truth and Justice will serve as a permanent reminder that corruption has consequences and that truth, however long buried, will eventually surface." Mund. The Johnson, Kowalski, and Washington families each received compensation checks that would help them rebuild their lives. While money couldn't restore their lost heritage, It provided acknowledgement of the wrongs they'd suffered and resources for their children and grandchildren. Margaret's final article about the case won a state journalism award and led to investigations of similar fraud schemes in 3 neighboring counties. The ripple effects of Grandpa Joe's evidence continued to spread, bringing justice to families we'd never even known existed. As the ceremony concluded, I walked back to the farm, now fully restored to its original 112 acres. The oak tree stood as majestic as ever, its carved message now a historical artifact rather than a desperate clue. I sat on the porch where Grandpa Joe had spent countless evenings, watching the sun set over land that was finally, truly ours again. In my hands, I held the deed that bore our family name and the correct acreage, a document that represented not just property ownership, but the triumph of patience and principle over greed and corruption. The box that had started this journey sat beside me, no longer buried, but displayed proudly on the mantelpiece inside. Its contents had served their purpose, transforming from hidden evidence into instruments of justice. Grandpa Joe had kept his promise. The land was mine, and now it was properly documented. But more than that, he taught me that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what's written on paper. It's the courage to fight for what's right, even when the battle takes decades to win. Thank you for listening to this story about family, justice, and the power of truth. I hope it reminded you that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that help others, as well as ourselves. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from around the world. I love hearing from listeners everywhere. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more tales that explore the hidden truths and unexpected discoveries that shape our lives. Until next time, remember that every family has secrets, and sometimes those secrets hold the key to justice.